In this video, we're going to learn about the mature phase of a star's life cycle. In this phase, the main sequence star reaches the end of its main sequence life and undergoes a number of changes on the inside that result in the star expanding to thousands or even millions of times larger than its original size as a main sequence star. And this new form of the star is what we call a red giant. So what exactly causes red giant stars to form? Well, to understand that, we need to remember what the function of the core of a star is. Remember that the core of the star is where the majority of nuclear fusion takes place in order to generate the star's energy. And nuclear fusion relies on smaller elements such as hydrogen gas, but when the core no longer has enough hydrogen gas in order to perform this reaction, the core is no longer functioning. And as a result, instead of the core undergoing nuclear fusion, the nuclear fusion reactions now take place outside of the core in the rest of the body of the star. And when this begins to happen, when fusion begins to take place outside of the core, this causes the regions between the core and the surface, the chromosphere of the star, to greatly expand, causing the star to form into a red giant. Now, despite the fact that the star enlarges itself by thousands or even millions of times, red giant stars actually have much lower temperatures than main sequence stars. Red giant stars are actually among the coolest type of stars that exist in the universe. Now, when this happens, when a main sequence star expands into its red giant form, it is actually in the latter part of its life cycle because the core previously generated most of the energy used to sustain a main sequence star for tens of billions of years. At this point, a red giant star typically has a lifespan of much shorter than its main sequence counterpart because eventually red giant stars are going to run out of hydrogen in the body of the star as well, in which case they are no longer able to produce any additional energy. When they run out of hydrogen, they release all of the outside layers between the core and the chromosphere into space. So any gas that remains in these outer layers and any of the extra energy that was produced through hydrogen fusion in the body of the star is released into space into these spectacular displays that we see on the right, which are what we call planetary nebulas, or planetary nebula singular. Now, this is a little bit of a misnomer because planetary nebulas were named as such because they have a structure that can be seen in the center of the planetary nebula, which early astronomers believed to actually be a planet. However, this is technically incorrect, and even the word nebula doesn't make a lot of sense because this refers to the accumulation of gas and dust that leads to the formation of the star and not the death of a star that we see in planetary nebulas. So if the structure in the center of a planetary nebula is not a planet, well, what exactly is it? Well, after a planetary nebula occurs, the core of the dead star that is no longer able to perform nuclear fusion can be found remaining in the center of the planetary nebula, forming a special type of star that we call a white dwarf star. And white dwarf stars are quite small from the perspective of other stars. We can see that Sirius B, an example of a white dwarf star, is only about the same size as a small planet. It's actually smaller than Earth in terms of its diameter, but it somehow manages to retain the mass of what the original main sequence star was. So imagine that you're taking the mass of Earth's sun and condensing it into a volume that is just a little bit smaller than Earth. This results in white dwarf stars having extremely high densities, that being a very large mass condensed into a small volume. So again, imagine the sun's mass in an area or in a volume the size of Earth, and you get some of the densest known objects in known space. Now, white dwarfs are technically considered stars and technically can be seen through telescopes emitting light, but again, they no longer produce energy through nuclear fusion, so the light source that we see from white dwarfs is actually the star shedding any leftover thermal energy that was not released during the planetary nebula. Now, if we take a look at larger main sequence stars, remember the Sun is only a small to medium-sized main sequence star, but if we were to look at a larger main sequence star, such as Sirius, they undergo a similar transformation at their mature phase. Only the red giant stars that they can grow into are often hundreds or even thousands of times larger than a typical red giant star, and can in turn be millions if not billions of times larger than a main sequence star such as our Sun. And if a regular red giant is called a red giant, then these super red giant stars are naturally what we would call red supergiants. So again, these are the red giants that are formed when larger main sequence stars reach the end of their main sequence lifespan and then expand into their red giant form. Now, due to the fact that the expansion of the main sequence star is significantly larger than with smaller stars, that means that the death of the star is also going to be a lot more spectacular, resulting in very large explosions light years wide across. So instead of simply shedding their outer layers of the star in a planetary nebula, red supergiants undergo a much more violent form of stellar death, or what we call stellar collapse, and these explosions in space are what we call supernovas, which again release any of the unused gas in the outer layers of the star and any remaining energy that was produced by the star deep into space. Now, the name supernova is rather interesting. Super, of course, means very big, but nova is actually a Latin word which means new. So why did we name a supernova something new when it results, or when supernovas occur because of the death of the star? Well, all of this gas and energy that is released by the supernova doesn't actually disappear. It's scattered deep into space. And if this gas and energy were to collect within a certain area of space and congeal into a protostar once again, we can see that all of this material, the interstellar gas and dust released by a supernova, can actually become recycled and reform into a new star through a nebula process. And this is why we refer to the life cycle of a star as a cycle, because all of the matter that is released by a supernova will eventually be recycled in the formation of new stars. In part 2 of this video, we're going to look at what happens to a star's core after a supernova has occurred, and look at some of the most interesting and simultaneously terrifying objects that exist in known space.